Welcome to the free lie detection lesson. I am Igor Vitale, psychologist, and I'll explain you how to detect lies in critical situations. This lesson is an educational support for the live course of the European project 1 Minute May Save a Life, led by Zivac Group Central from Bucharest. Lie detection techniques has a long history. The first description of the liar has been found in an ancient Indian document called Vedas. Today, lie detection sciences subdivide its methods in these three groups. The first one, called physiological methods. The second, non-verbal methods. And the third one, we will talk about this, the verbal methods. Physiological methods are based on the connection between lies and physiological indicators. Lying is a distressing activity that leads to physiological variation in parameters like breathing rate, heartbeat, and skin conductance. These methods have many advantages. In fact, it's very difficult to manage this automatic variation. For example, polygraph is based on this. Many other new instruments are used in research to study lies. For example, fMRI or electrogastrogram are some of the methods in this field. But these methods have many difficulties. It's needed a difficult training to use them, and they request time. Physiological methods are not used during emergency calls. A second method is called non-verbal method, and assumes that lies leads to non-verbal behavior variations. Non-verbal behavior represents the inner state of the subject. For this reason, comparing non-verbal behavior with the verbal statement is a useful method for lie detection purposes. However, during the emergency call, only a little part of non-verbal behavior is available. In fact, non-verbal behavior includes a very broad range of signs like gestures, that includes the arms and the hands movements, self-manipulating gestures, including rubbing, scratching body parts in order to reduce psychological tension, illustrative gestures, movements that complete the sense of a sentence with symbolic movement, postures including trunk, shoulders, arms, and head positioning. These aspects are often related to submission and dominance schemas. Eye behavior including eye movement, pupil dilation, and blink rate. One of the most important parts of non-verbal communication is for sure facial expressions. The most important part of non-verbal behavior related to emotion expressiveness. Then we have some other aspects of non-verbal behavior that are very important, and you can detect it also during phone calls and emergency calls. The first one is CHRONEMICS, the use of time in body language. Includes velocity of movements and synchronicity between speech and body movement. Obviously, while hearing just the voice of the caller, you can understand the timing about some voice characteristics, so the presence of pauses, if the person has a rapid speech or a slow speech. These aspects are called CHRONEMICS. Then we have also PROXEMICS, that indicates the use of space of the body of our interlocutor, but also interpersonal distance, the use of space. You cannot observe directly this during an emergency call, but you can understand and can make some deduction about this, because the caller can say to you that he's moving from a place to another, or you can hear the sound of some steps, and hearing so if the person is moving or if someone is approaching a person. But probably the most important part of nonverbal behavior that you can analyze during an emergency call is the voice characteristics. So, the rhythm, the volume, the tone of voice, the presence of breathing variation, and the presence of non-words can give you some psychological information about the caller. Most of non-verbal aspects cannot be analyzed during emergency calls. Some of them can be deducted. For example, you can hear steps, as I said before. and this can indicate some space variation of the subject. We may say also that the body position affects voice use, so if the person is stand up, the voice will be different. But the most important part of nonverbal behavior for the emergency calls analysis is the voice characteristics. There is a strong connection between voice and emotion. For this reason, voice analysis is strictly related to the inner states of the caller. At the same time, it's very important for the dispatcher to manage his own voice in order to communicate effectively with the caller, in order to induce calmness when needed, and to deliver correct instructions. The third area of lie detection is called verbal statement analysis. Words are a prominent part of the emergency call. The way in which we organize our sentences reveal many subtle information about our inner state, our intention and reactions. When nonverbal aspects are hidden, verbal behavior and voice characteristics consist much more information. In a critical situation like emergency calls, subtle aspect of communication is an amplified message. There is a very important fact in emergency calls analysis. The communication for the caller is not ordinary day communication, it's a critical and new situation for most of the caller. For this reason, there is a great variability in the caller speech. Everybody reacts to stress in very different ways. Some callers will react to stress screaming and shouting, some others lowering the volume of voice or the tone of voice. The communication during emergency calls is very different from ordinary calls. The tension of the subject is very high, especially in the first part of the call, and there are significant changes in safety and health of the subject. The role of dispatchers is to reduce unuseful communication, additional time losing, increased anxiety and loss of control in the caller. Dispatchers communicate with a very broad range of subjects, and for this reason quality protocols should be integrated with sufficient flexibility in questioning techniques. In critical situations, victims and witnesses often remember the words of the key conversation for the whole life. This is true in bad news communication, communication of severe illnesses, injuries, or communication of death. But this is true also in critical emergency calls. For this reason, the communication of dispatcher's ability should be increased by psychological trainings. At the same time, the continuous communication in critical situations can impact on dispatcher's psychological health, and support should be provided in order to reduce stress and other negative outcomes. Before to start with the technical aspects for recognizing false emergency calls, it's important to go in depth on the psychology of emergency calls. The first important rule in emergency calls analysis is that witnesses, victims and other persons involved in the event are not objective observers of reality. It's approved in scientific community that humans' memory processes are characterized by biases and fallacies. It's this the reason why humans witnessing the same event can report it very differently. In fact, there are many sources of inaccuracy in witnessing an event. The first one is called personality traits. Optimistic people tend to overestimate goodness of a situation, while pessimistic people tend to overestimate negative aspects of a situation. Many researchers show that, for example, depressed people tend to overestimate sadness also in neutral situations. A second source of inaccuracy is called stress. It's been demonstrated. The second source of inaccuracy is called stress. It's demonstrated that stress reduces correct events memorization. The third aspect is called direct involvement in the incident. This can reduce the quality of information, like the personal relationship with the victim. Another fact that affects our memory during the witnessing an event, is the communication baseline. This is not possible to study this communication baseline during emergency or during single event communication, because every person has a specific profile in terms of communication. There are some communication tendencies of the subject, like gestures, tone of voice, volume of voice, speediness of speech. All these common aspects in communication represent the baseline of the subject, his usual way of communication. The study of differences inside the communication of the subject is very important in every communication analysis. However, it's quite difficult to know the baseline of the subject during the emergency call because it's a really strange, extraordinary fact. The situation in which the subject is, the emergency call, is not an ordinary event for most of the callers. In the immediacy of the emergency calls, we cannot study all disturbance factors that in absolute can affect the quality of information, because the dispatcher's focus should be on protocols and effective questioning. However, this process is very important in emergency call analysis and training. We have to consider two main filters in emergency call communications. The first one is callers filter reality based on their own personality and perception tendencies. The first one is callers filter reality based on their own personality and perception tendencies. The second, callers filter their thoughts and perception based on their language. And on the first call, we haven't specific information about the basic language of the subject, the personality, and his perception tendencies. Language is in fact always an accurate way to represent thought. It's not possible to represent completely thoughts by language. Transformational linguistics showed that language is affected by three processes: cancellation, transformation, and deformation. Indicators of false calls. In this lesson, I will show you main aspects to monitor during an emergency call, because some little variation in the caller's communication can help you in detecting false calls. You have to check the first aspect that I will show you here. It's called pauses. The analysis of pauses in communication can really help you in the understanding of unexpressed aspect of communication. In the study of pauses, it's very important to the study of timing. You should check exactly where the pause is, because unexpected positioning of the pause can affect significantly the psychological meaning of the sentence. If we recognize at the end of a communication that there were many pauses, but we cannot remember when exactly, we have a partial information. The first general meaning of pauses to consider is that pauses are negative correlated with arousal. The more we have activation in the subject, the more is the chance to have less pauses. Anxiety, emergency, urgency are related to less pauses and to speech overlapping. Inversely, the pause is often related to deactivation of the subject or the cognitive arousal. The subject is reasoning on what to say, and this can be due to many reasons, so we may have many reasons for the pause positioning. The first one is called uncertainty. The subject can be in doubt during a call on what to say, or is facing difficulties in managing the accident. In other cases, the subject may have verbal impairment or low cultural level. And searching word can be due mainly to this. We have to say also that stressful situations affect negatively verbal performance. The second source is called lying. The subject, for many different reasons, can lie to dispatcher. Cognitive arousal and hidden information can produce irregular pauses in the conversation, and I show you after how to detect these. The third source of pauses is called cognitive complexity. There may be difficult aspect of reality to explain. So let's check when we usually put pauses in our conversation, and also how to put it effectively and how to detect the unexpected positioning of the pause in our conversation. We usually put pauses in our conversation in different points. We use pauses to separate concepts, so we organize our speech separating topics, and often the pause suggests a change of focus. But also we use pauses to increase clarity of information. We put pauses where ideally in our conversation should be a point or a comma. These general rules in emergency communication are often violated, and this leads to irregular pauses indicating cognitive arousal or lower immediacy. Let's make this example, this exercise, just compare this pause positioning in the same sentence. I began to write my master's degree thesis, and I can say that my professor is very good. So the pause was between thesis and I can say. Let's hear the second example. It's exactly the same words, but we'll change the pause. I began to write my master's degree thesis, and I can say that my professor is very good. Okay, the two sentences has exactly the same wording, but the psychological sense is completely different. Before to read the solution, just ask yourself what is the psychological meaning of these two sentences. Please click on stop this video and just ask yourself the differences of this pause positioning. Okay, I will give you now a solution for the first exercise, and let's check if you managed correctly this exercise or if you have many other ideas on this interpretation. We know that we're talking about psychology, and so there is not always one possible correct answer. The first sentence has a correct pause positioning. In fact, the pause is in the right point. It separates two concepts in the sentence. The second has an additional pause after the word very and the word good. What can be the different interpretation of this sentence? The irregular pause, it doesn't indicate a comma. You shouldn't put a comma between very and good, obviously. Indicates cognitive arousal. When you interpret cognitive arousal, you should think that the complexity is due to the word right after the pause. What specifically can lead to a pause in that specific moment? Probably the person is trying to search an appropriate adjective for defining the professor. Very good. But this cognitive arousal leads to a relatively easy word. The word good is very common. Good is the adjective used for defining the professor in that situation and doesn't suggest complexity. Probably the subject doesn't believe that his own sentence is true, so he don't believe that good is the right adjective for defining the professor. A second indicator relative to pause irregularity is the absence of a pause when you should have a pause. So also in some situations you could expect a pause, but it doesn't happen. When there is a significant aspect of reality, you should use a pause or a significant voice pitch variation. Let's take this example. Make attention to the wording and also to the use of pause, because it's very important. This is second example. There is disorder on the room. There is blood on the bathroom. There is door locked and the road is Dante Road at the number 29. What should be the correct analysis of this sentence? In which point the caller wants to put the attention? Just take time to answer to this question, make attention to the pause, and then continue the lesson. If you put the attention correctly, there are three important things, and for the subject, because we have three pauses, and so he separates the concept this way. The first one is disorder in the room, the second is the blood, and the third is the location. There is a significant variation. In fact, on the aspect of the door locked, we haven't a pause, but this is a very important thing. It's very strange to come back home and finding that the door is locked. A door is locked, and you don't know what is over the door. This is a strange variation. In fact, considering the information in possession of dispatchers, the disorder seems not to be really relevant because you don't know what happened in your house. But the caller wants to put attention on this, while the door locked seems not a point of attention for the caller. There should be a reason for this incongruence, and the door locked remains an important point of attention for the investigators. It should be noted that the subject is taking time in talking about the location. In fact, the road is Dante Road and the number 29 is a very long sentence, and there's also the word repetition. And we have to say that word repetition is an indicator of deceit. The modulation of voice is related to emotionality of the caller. When we are bored or there are no critical situations to manage, no variation in our context, we don't put modulation of the voice. If there is no reference to our safety or to the safety of significant others, our tone of voice remains on the same musical note. Variation in intonation of the voice reveals that the subject is involved in what he says. True stories have more often the modulation of voice, while false have detached tone of voice, the same musical note we may say. You should consider the absence of modulation of voice as a point of attention where there are important and very critical situations. For example, a person who's saying the sentence "a murder has been committed" with monochord tone of voice may indicate detachment, avoidant attachment, depersonalization of the subject who's probably depersonalizing himself. At the same time, a monochord tone of voice of a husband stating a severe accident of his wife is suspect. In fact, in critical situations, especially where there's a personal relationship between the caller and the victim, it's strange to have no voice variation in the caller. We expect emotional variations. The tone of voice can also determine the level of certainty of a statement. It's important to study the tone of voice differences in the same statement. In particular, we may say that the tone going down at the end of the sentence indicates certainty, command, authority. When the tone remains stable, second indicator, in the same sentence there is emotional detachment for the subject, so no emotional involvement. And the third one, the tone going up at the end of the sentence, indicates perplexity, uncertainty. This is the tone of voice that we use when we do question. But the question has implicitly the aspect of uncertainty, the aspect of presenting different alternatives to compare and to choose one of them to give the answer. I give you the third exercise. Try to pronounce this sentence using the three tone of voice. The second part of the sentence should be pronounced with the variation, so going up, going down, or remain stable with the tone of voice. Make attention to use and change just one parameter of the voice, so just the tone of voice and not the volume. The sentence that I give you is, this is an emergency call. Emergency call is the second part of the sentence and you should put a variation, so going up, going down, and remain stable. So if you want to try this exercise, just pause the video, put the pause on video, and try to pronounce this sentence in different way. Okay, if you try this, maybe you perceived some differences in your voice intonation. Now, just to make an example, I do the exercise with you to understand if you've done this correctly. This is an emergency call is the sentence I will pronounce with the tone of voice going up. This is an emergency call. This is an emergency call. I used the increasing tone of voice at the end of the sentence. I may say, we remaining stable, this is an emergency call. In this case, I used the same tone of voice for all the sentence. Or the third one, I can say, this is an emergency call. The third one is the tone of voice going down. What difference can you perceive in different voice intonation? We usually do not modulate our voice, and voice modulation can reveal hidden information about subject states. So make attention to the modulation of voice, remembering that the monochord tone of voice is related to detachment, and so to zero involvement in the event, and this can be really strange for a subject who's witnessing a particular event. Usually there is emotional involvement. We have another indicator, the voice volume, that indicates urgency in the subject. It's expected to have a high volume of voice, especially in critical situations, and especially at the beginning of the call. Research showed that the highest pitch of emotionality is at the beginning of the call and during particular negative changes in the victim states. The voice volume reduction is connected to the will to hidden information or used for suggesting confidentiality of information. For example, a victim of a probably domestic violence can experiment fear in some situation or have the fear to be catched while calling the emergency call by the offender, and so she or he can reduce the volume voice in order to hidden information to the offender mainly. So you have to make attention to this. This is really common in violence, in domestic violence, but also in stalking. Sometimes it's a reaction, it's a defense mechanism of the victim, and so don't consider that lowering the voice volume is always a negative effect. Okay, it's maybe in most cases positive as a psychological function. Let's check this new indicator. It's called interrupting the dispatcher. Talking during dispatcher speech is an indicator of urgency. In many cases, the subject starts to talk before the first sentence of the dispatcher. So the dispatcher says, "What is your emergency?" But the subject, the caller, is already talking. This indicates dominance of the subject, but this indicator is true especially usually in daily conversation. If you're talking with somebody who's interrupting you constantly, probably you're talking with the dominant people. However, especially in critical calls, it's not expected to have a caller who respects hours of a conversation. Usually, callers don't understand the meaning of a question and perceive that many questions are not relevant or much less important than sending the ambulance now or law enforcement or what needed. Usually, false calls or suspect calls are characterized by a caller who respects hours of conversation, because in that case, in that specific false calls, there is less sense of urgency. Unconsciously, the persons don't want that law enforcement or the ambulance or the firefighters will arrive on the place, and so the subject, the caller, will take time. He has no problem of timing, and this is strange, obviously, in emergency situation. Let's check this new indicator called positive and negative words. Our emotional states affect the selection of words we use in our conversation. It's proven that happiness and positive states increase the use of polite language, while negative states increase the chance to have slang, bad words, negative words. Obviously, we expect to have negative states in emergency call, especially in the first part of the call, because the first part of the call is very important to communicate what is the reason why you called the number, the 112. For example, if in the first part of the call we have this sentence, "I have been shot and my husband has been shot," there is a strong incongruence between the expected negative states and the use of the friendly word, the polite word, "I," that we use in friendly communication. We use this when we are in positive states and in positive situation, not during an emergency call. Or let's check this example, this real example. "Can you kindly send me the ambulance?" Compared with the subsequent sentence, "My wife is not breathing," is incongruent. In fact, the word "kindly" is part of polite language. Obviously, polite language is a good thing, but you don't expect to have this in a critical situation. So it's strange. It's referring to a positive state of the subject, but it's strange to have a subject who's in a positive state during an emergency call. In that case, in that specific case, when you had the sentence, "Can you kindly send me the ambulance?" the investigators revealed that the wife shot his husband and then tried to injure herself to try to simulate a fight. At the same time, the use of negative adjective tends to be increased by negative states. So we may say the same thing using extreme word, bad words, or something more polite. I can say for describing a person that is very accurate, or I may say that the same person is obsessive. Maybe I'm saying the same thing, but obsessive is a stronger term comparing to accurate, for example. When we feel negative emotions, we tend to increase negative aspects of life. This is the reason why sometimes also little emergencies are communicated as severe accidents. Often the person lives for the first time the emergency. For this reason, the caller don't know how to communicate correctly and increase the little emergency communicating as a big one. The emergency for most subjects is something new, very different from status quo, and this leads to increase the level of urgency. This is normal and truthful emergency call. You have the little one, but you will communicate as a big one. It's strange to have the opposite situation. In false calls, you may observe an opposite tendency, because in false calls, who's calling, the person who's calling has not the real objective to bring the ambulance in the place. And so maybe the emergency is big, but they will say there is a little cut, there is a little, and so minimizing the gravity, the severity of the accident. The word little suggests that it's not something relevant, but in reality, in normal emergency situation, the person will try to exaggerate the gravity, the severity of the accident. So it's strange to have people who minimize the situation, saying something like a little thing, a little cut. Let's check the new chapter about the projection in second and third person. When a subject lies, tends to use some defense mechanism that lead to hidden himself. For example, in interviews and interrogation situation, the subject tends to make less movements, so less arm and hand movements, and these lead to less attention to him. If I move in a situation, I will catch the attention of the other person. If I stand still and can do movement, and so I do less movements or little one, I will catch less the attention of the talker about the person in front of me. It's a strategy used to reduce the arousal determined by fear. The unconscious sensation that we may have the attention of the subject on us lead us to less self-reference. So non-verbally we move less, but also verbally we will put less self-references. So one specific chapter indicators is called, this indicator is called reduction of self-reference. So which specific sentences of indicators you can find in false emergency calls? The first one is called less references to the caller. The second is called less word I, so less references to I or to me. The third one is reference to himself talking in a second person. For example, I may talk about myself saying, when you see there is nothing to do, you lose control. Okay, I use you when talking about me. And this is a way to dissociate myself from the situation, from the event. It's an unconscious thing. Nobody decides I want to use the second person. Almost nobody. Another indicator that used for the reduction of self-reference is called reference to himself talking in a third person. It's the same, but you use the third person to dissociate more. For example, in situations like this, it's not possible to control instinctive reactions, but I'm talking about myself, okay? And so also in this case, I'm showing less attention to me. Or I can put myself as object in the sentence, for example, saying, I know myself, so I will put myself as object. Or for example, I can remove the subject, so the last case is called inexistent subject. For example, if you hear this sentence, we will recognize there is no real subject. A homicide has been committed. Okay, there is no subject. Or the gun has shot. The subject is the gun, but the gun will shot only with a person, obviously. Why, in a particular situation like the emergency call, a person who decides to call the 112 number should cancel himself from this sentence? I leave you the answer, obviously, but he maybe understood that it's probably a false call or there is something strange in that call, and so more investigation are needed. Let's check the new indicator. This is a very important one, and this is a focus on the victim. This is called depersonalization of the victim distancing language. The way in which we describe persons indicates also our relationship with them. This indicator is very important also in daily life. We usually use formal language with persons psychologically distant from us, and use the first name for the person that we perceive similar or close to us. So we use different way to refer to people based on our closeness or distance to that person. When a person is in danger, we usually tend to reduce our aggressiveness against him, trying to be close to this person. However, some person can react in an opposite way, distancing the victim. And this is strange because this is related to false calls. Now, I'll show you some language styles using for distancing victims. They are the same for distancing people, but I have to say you this. False and suspect calls has a significant higher level of distancing language. So, as we said, for every indicator I talked to, we have to say that one indicator is not enough for saying this is a false call, obviously. But if you analyze the call and you find 10, 20 indicators in the same call or in the same topic inside the call, you should make a bigger and in-depth analysis of that call. Let's check all indicators for distancing language. The more specific is the word that we use for defining the person, the more close is the relationship implicitly described. The first one is usually pronounced in the communication and in daily life, and is using the first name of the person. This is not an example of distancing language. If I say Mario or Giuseppe, we use the first name of the person when we feel or strongly desire closeness with the person. So this indicates two things. I can use the first name because I'm really close to that person, or because I desire closeness with that person. However, this is not usually an emergency call because you are talking to an unknown person, and the dispatcher, you don't know directly that person, and so you will use a specific term to indicate closeness, but maybe not the first name. The second type of distancing language or closeness language is using a term that qualifies the relationship between the caller and the victim. In this case, the caller is not depersonalizing the victim, and so this is correct. Is not using defensive strategies. He may use or she may use words like husband, son, wife, and this identify the relationship and the role of the person, and so the person is not applying defense mechanism. It's direct language, it's not distancing. The third way is another way to indicating closeness between person, between the caller and the victim, is using possessive adjectives. This is not distancing language. Using possessive adjectives means taking responsibility and closeness with the person. A caller may say, my wife is not breathing, or the wife is not breathing. The concept is the same, but the psychological meaning is completely different, because in the first case, the caller is suggesting closeness, is using my, and so using the possessive adjective. While in the second case, the caller is distancing himself from the wife, saying the wife is not breathing. And so the doesn't specify the sense of possession of closeness between two close persons. Why a person should distance himself from the victim in a so critical situation. Okay, so if the person used the first name or used the possessive adjective or use, for example, a specific term that qualifies the relationship, he's using closeness language. But let's check the most important distancing language, because we should have a doubt and put more attention to investigation where the subject was calling using a very distancing language, because there is no specific reason why a person should distance himself from the victim in a critical situation. Let's check the first one. The first indicator is called using not specific terms. This is obviously distancing language, especially if there is a personal relationship between the victim and the caller. For example, as described before, a person can say my wife for defining the person, or can distance more saying the wife, or much more saying a wife or a woman or a person now can seem you strange to hear this word, a person, for referring to the wife, to his wife, but it happens in some emergency, suspect emergency call. We had cases in which there were a specific relationship between the caller and the victim. There were boyfriend and girlfriend, so there were a relationship, and the boyfriend calling for the case of his girlfriend who were dying, he described the victim as a person. A person is a more depersonalizing fact possible, the more depersonalizing description possible for the victim. And this is really strange. Many of these formulae are also not grammatically correct, and this is more probable in the stressful situation. A wife is not correct. However, we can say that the more is not specific the definition of the subject, the more the caller is distancing itself from the victim. The second indicator of distancing language is using distancing pronouns. Use pronouns to describe closeness and distance. For example, a caller may say, I feel the same sense of difficulty. The same sense. Suggesting closeness with the emotion. Or may say, same subject, same situation, I feel this same sense of difficulty. Also the term this suggests closeness. We use this or the while talking about close objects, persons, behaviors, or something. However, in this case, using this in that sentence is inappropriate and not completely correct. It's an indicator, you have an indicator of discomfort when you do grammatical errors. However, the third example that I show you now is actually more clear and is really a distancing language example. Let's take this sentence. I feel that same sense of difficulty. This is really distancing. You use the word that when you describe distant things. But senses of emotion are not physically distant or close, and so you can use that or this just to represent closeness with the concept or not. So saying I feel that sense of disease, so the sentence I feel that same sense of difficulty is strange. Probably this is not really a true and linear sentence. Obviously, now I said to you a really clear example because you know that emotions, senses can be close or distant. But we may say the same thing when talking about relationship between persons. For example, I may say I don't want to talk to Mary, using a complete linear and direct sentence. Or I may say I don't want to talk to the person. And this is really distancing because Mary changing person, that is depersonalizing. Or we may say something more distancing that indicates something bad in the relationship. For example, the subject may say I don't want to talk with that person. That is distancing. Now I show you another example, really subtle. Usually people don't control this aspect in verbal communication, and this is a specific way to creating distancing language. And this is separating subject. When we feel distance from a person, we use to separate the names in the sentence. The language pattern that suggests more closeness in the use of we and us. For example, the following sentence is characterized by closeness. We faced the same challenge, or we've been shot. The use of we indicates closeness, unity. The same concept can be verbalized separating subject with a more distancing version. For example, my husband and I have been shot. Okay, it's always we. But my husband and I are separated in the sentence, and this indicates a little level more of distance between the subjects. It's possible to distance more the subjects in a sentence. If you read the previous sentence, subjects are separated but not very distant. My husband and I. Let's read this example. I've been shot and also my husband has been shot. this is a more distancing version because it's not my husband and I, so really near in the sentence, but separated by a different word. There are two reasons why this is a specific distancing version. The first is that the subjects are more distant in a sentence. The second is the word also that suggests that the safety of the husband is an additional fact and less important than the first sentence, so the wife's safety and health. Let's check this example. I've been shot, but also my husband has been shot. This is scary because there is another important thing. The use but suggests much more distance. We use the word but when we want to put the concepts in opposition, so these are not ordered in a first and second place, but opposite. The word also or and, we talk about addition, but with the word but, you're talking about opposition between concepts. And why the wife should distance herself from his husband in a critical situation like this? Obviously, this is a focus, it's an indicator of lie, of deceit. Let's check the fourth indicator of distancing language. This is called distancing with. We use the word with when we talk about accessories. A caller may say, we went to the parking lot, so using the sense of unity, as we said before. But if you hear the sentence, I went to the parking lot with my husband, the second version is more distancing because the second subject is not the first, is not unified with the word we, but is separated. Separated is with my husband. This indicates much distance between the caller and the husband. Now, I want to thank you for your participation to this lesson about lie detection of the European project 1 Minute May Save Life, led by Zivac Group from Bucharest. I will thank you very much. I will give you more information about this. If you have specific question about lie detection, please contact me on igor@igorvitale.org. I will give you more information about this. If you have specific question, please contact me and I will be happy to give you some answers and some input about this. Thank you very much.